The river has become a trap. That is the first image to hold in your mind. Not an open battlefield, not a city wall. The Volga River, one of the great arteries of the Eastern world, has turned into a killing corridor choked with broken ships, panicked crews, and the wreckage of a huge expedition trying to force its way home. It is the autumn of 913 AD, and the air over the water is thick with smoke, shouting, and the aftermath of a battle no man on that river will ever forget. Picture one of the trapped ships near the centre of the chaos. A dozen Rus warriors are still standing. Their axes are up, their shields are splintered down to the grip. They are hard men, conditioned by a lifetime of rowing, raiding, bargaining, and surviving things that would kill lesser people. And they are terrified. Not the quick terror of a surprise ambush, something worse. The long, grinding horror of men who have had 3 days to watch everything fall apart and have run completely out of options. From both riverbanks, thousands of horsemen close in. These are not frightened villagers or poorly armed militia. They are the Arsiya, the Muslim palace guard of the Khazar Khaganate, soldiers connected with Khwarezm who serve as a powerful military arm of the Khagan. They are armoured, they are furious, and they have been waiting for this moment for months. Arrows hammer into wooden shields, the horsemen press along the banks and shallows, they keep coming. The Rus on those trapped ships have just made one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in Viking raiding history. In Al-Masudi's telling, they came here with 500 ships, each carrying about 100 men, a medieval figure that may well be inflated, but still points to an enormous expedition. They tore through one of the wealthiest coastlines of the Islamic world. They filled their hulls with gold, silk, captives, and silver until the ships rode dangerously low in the water. They were, by every measure they understood, invincible. They were wrong. To see how a huge Rus fleet ended up trapped and destroyed on the Volga, not in the lands it had attacked, but on the way home, struck by the very power that had let it pass, we have to go back several months, back to a meeting that must have felt at the time like the greatest deal in the history of the North. By the early 10th century, the Norsemen who had pushed east, the Varangians, the Rus, inhabited a different universe from their cousins raiding the monasteries of England or sacking the coastlines of Francia. The Western Vikings knew the world they were plundering. They had been hitting the same shores for a century. The Eastern Rus had gone somewhere far stranger. They had followed the river system of the Slavic interior, the Volkhov, the Dnieper, the Don, the Volga, deep into a continent that most Europeans of the era could not have placed on a map. They had built trading posts and fortified towns at places like Novgorod and Kiev, not as acts of mercy or civilization, but because controlling river junctions meant controlling commerce. And commerce, in this part of the world, meant wealth on a scale that made the silver trinkets of English monasteries look laughably small. The Rus had already raided Constantinople. They had pushed trading networks into the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate, carrying furs, amber, and slaves southward and bringing back silver dirhams by the hundreds of thousands. Ibn Fadlan, the Arab diplomat who encountered a group of Rus traders on the Volga in 921 AD, just a few years after the events of this story, described them as tall, tattooed, permanently armed, and utterly indifferent to the religious or cultural sensibilities of anyone around them. They were, in his words, the filthiest of God's creatures. He meant it as an insult. Reading it now, it honestly sounds like exactly the kind of men who would look at the Caspian Sea and think, we should rob that, the Caspian. In the Arabic sources of the 10th century, it is called the Sea of Georgian, or the Sea of Tabaristan, named for the wealthy Islamic provinces that lined its southern and western shores. Al-Masudi, the Arab historian and geographer who recorded this entire story in his masterwork Muruj al-Dahab, The Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems, would later describe it as one of the most prosperous coastlines in the known world. The cities there were old, cultured, and extraordinarily rich. Tabaristan, on the southern shore in what is now northern Iran, produced silk and luxury goods traded widely across the medieval Islamic world. The region around Baku, the Naphtha country, as Arab geographers called it, was famous for oil seeps and natural flames, a landscape that fascinated travellers and religious communities for centuries. What this coastline did not have was any meaningful naval defence capable of stopping an expedition on this scale. The Islamic rulers of the southern Caspian had faced earlier raids, but nothing like this. The sea had mostly been a highway for traders, not a highway for massed northern war fleets. The mountains to the south and west were their walls. The sea was their garden, and nobody, in the recorded memory of these cities had ever come through it, with 500 ships full of armed Rus raiders. That was about to change. But the Caspian was not simply sitting there waiting to be looted. To reach it from the north, from the Norse world of rivers and Baltic amber, a fleet had to pass through a very specific geographic choke point. The Don and Volga rivers run roughly parallel across the steppe of what is now southern Russia, and at one point they come within easy portaging distance of each other, near what is today Volgograd. Get your ships across that portage, drop them into the Volga, and you can float all the way down to the Caspian Sea. It is, in geographic terms, an almost impossibly convenient backdoor into the Islamic world. The keeper of that backdoor was the Khazar Khaganate. The Khazars were one of the most extraordinary political entities of the medieval world, a Turkic-speaking confederation that had carved out a commercial empire across the steppes of what is now southern Russia, stretching from the northern Caucasus to the lower Volga. Their capital, Atil, sat at the mouth of the Volga, where it fans into the Caspian, positioned with almost architectural precision at the exact point where northern trade goods met southern markets. The Khazars did not produce wealth. They taxed it. Every caravan, every boat, every bale of silk and bar of silver that passed through their territory paid a toll, and those tolls had made them powerful enough to hold off the Umayyad Caliphate's armies at the Caucasus passes and keep the steppe peoples to their north in a state of grudging deference. Crucially, the ruling class of the Khazar Khaganate had, sometime in the 8th century, converted to Judaism, a decision so unusual in the history of Central Eurasian politics that scholars are still debating the full implications of it today. What it meant practically was that the Khazar Khagan ruled over a multi-religious population: Jewish nobles, Muslim merchants and soldiers, Christians and pagans, all living in a carefully maintained balance. The Muslim community within Khazaria, many of them traders, some of them soldiers, was substantial. This detail is not a footnote, it is the fuse running toward the entire explosion that is about to happen. In the year 912 or 913 AD, the Arabic sources give us after the year 300 of the Hijra, which corresponds to roughly late 912 into early 913 AD, a fleet appeared at the Khazar garrison guarding the Don-Volga portage. Al-Masudi's account is remarkably precise about the numbers: 500 ships, each carrying approximately 100 men. Do that arithmetic, and you arrive at a figure of around 50,000 warriors. Modern historians treat this number with some skepticism. Ancient sources routinely inflate military figures, but even a fraction of that force would represent a raiding party of staggering ambition. This was not an ordinary raid. It was a massive expedition with an exit strategy. Who commanded this fleet? The primary sources are frustratingly silent on a specific name. The leaders of the Rus at this moment were the successors to Prince Oleg of Kiev, who had died around 912 AD. Some historians associate the expedition broadly with the political turbulence following Oleg's death and the consolidation of power under the early Rurikid dynasty. What we can say with certainty is that whoever stood at the prow of that lead ship was operating at a level of strategic ambition that went well beyond the opportunistic coastal raiding that defined most Norse operations. This required planning, coordination, and the kind of cold-blooded calculation that comes from very smart, very dangerous men looking at a map and seeing something everyone else had missed. The Rus route south was not improvised. By the early 10th century, Norse traders and raiders had been probing the Volga corridor for at least 2 generations. They knew the river system. They had paid tolls at Khazar checkpoints before. They had watched the flow of Abbasid silver moving north in Arab merchants' packs and understood with the merchants' cold instinct where that silver came from. The Caspian raids were the next logical step. Not a gamble born of ignorance, but a calculated escalation by men who had already done the reconnaissance, already built the relationships and already mapped the door. They were not going in blind. They were going in with a plan and a partner. What is striking, when you sit with this, is how thoroughly the Rus had embedded themselves into the commercial nervous system of the Eastern world before they ever turned it into a target. They knew the Khazar economy because they had fed it for years: furs, amber, wax and Slavic slaves moving south while silver and silk came north. They knew the Khagans' appetite for revenue because they had satisfied it on every previous journey. And they knew the Caspian coastline was wealthy and unguarded because Arab geographers and Persian traders had been describing it in glowing terms for decades. The decision to raid it was, in its way, a culmination. Men who had spent years learning a system choosing the moment to exploit it completely. That kind of cold-blooded patience is not usually what comes to mind when people picture Viking raids, but it is what was actually operating here. The Rus envoys came to the Khagan with a proposition that was, on its face, almost insultingly straightforward. Let us through. Let us use your river. Let us sail into the Caspian and take what we want from the Islamic cities on the other side. In return, we will give you half of everything we plunder. The Khagan said yes. Personally, I find this moment one of the most fascinating in the entire story, and also one of the most chilling. Because think about what the Khagan was agreeing to. He was opening the door of his own home and pointing his guests toward the rooms of his neighbours. The cities that the Rus were about to devastate were not Khazar cities. They were Muslim cities, the same religion practiced by a significant portion of his own population, including the Arsia, his own palace guard. He was, in effect, subcontracting a massacre to a gang of Rus raiders and taking a 50% cut of the proceeds. Was it cynical? Absolutely. Was it rational? From a purely transactional, Khazar imperial interest standpoint, arguably, yes. The Khazars had no great love for the Muslim powers to their south. They had spent much of the 7th and 8th centuries fighting them off at the Caucasus. Letting the Rus bleed those coastlines weakened a rival sphere of influence while enriching Atil's treasury at zero military cost. It was cold statecraft of a very high order. But statecraft operates in the real world, and the real world contains human beings who watch their co-religionists get slaughtered and do not simply balance the ledger and move on. The Khagan had just lit a fuse inside his own capital, and he either did not know it or had decided the money was worth the risk. Al-Masudi tells us the fleet entered the Don estuary, crossed the portage, dropped into the Volga, past the town of Atil, and entered through its mouth into the Sea of the Khazar. The Khagan kept his word, the garrison let them through, and the 500 ships made their way down the great river unmolested, past the reed marshes of the delta, past the salt flats where the river dissolves into the inland sea, and out onto the open Caspian water. For many of the men on those ships, this sea must have felt like the edge of the known world. None of their sagas made it familiar. No Norse skald had made the silver light on Caspian water feel ordinary, or the way the flat steppe coastline to the west gives way to the abrupt dark wall of the Caucasus Mountains in the south, snow-capped even in summer. They were, by any reasonable measure, in a place that sat far outside the mental geography of most northern warriors. Back home in Scandinavia, it would have sounded like a dream or a lie. And out there, beyond the flat horizon, lay the richest undefended coastline any of them had ever seen. The Khagan had his deal, the Rus had their passage. The cities of Tabaristan and Gilan and the Naphtha country around Baku had no idea what was coming. For now, the water was calm. The Caspian, in the early autumn of 913 AD, was glassy and warm, and for men raised on the grey-green chop of the Baltic or the cold iron of the North Sea, its colour would have felt almost dreamlike, a deep blue sitting flat under a sky the size of the world. The fleet spread out across the water in a long staggered line, 500 hulls catching a steady wind, oars shipped, warriors resting between rowing shifts. They were now inside a sea that earlier Rus raiders had reached only in smaller, scattered attacks. This time was different. Every horizon was new to this huge expedition. Every shoreline ahead of them was vulnerable on a scale no one there had seen before. They made for the islands first. Al-Masudi records that the Rus established a temporary base on islands in the southwestern part of the Caspian, using them as a staging point from which to fan out along the coastline. This was standard Norse operating procedure. Find high ground or defensible water, anchor your ships, and send fast-moving parties ashore in waves. The islands gave them a safe place to bring plunder back, a place to hold captives, a place to rest and rearm between raids. From there, they could hit multiple targets along the shore and retreat back to the water before any organised ground response could reach them. It was a system refined over a century of raiding from Ireland to the Black Sea, and on this coast, against these people, it worked with devastating efficiency. The cities they fell on first were the coastal settlements of Gilan, Dalam and Tabaristan. The long green, densely populated zone running along what is now the northern edge of Iran, wedged between the Caspian Sea and the Alborz mountain range. These were not frontier towns, they were ancient settlements, wealthy from centuries of silk trade and agriculture, their bazaars stacked with bolts of fine cloth, their storehouses heavy with grain and oil, their households, right up to the moment the Rus ships appeared offshore, completely unaware that the world had changed. The Rus hit them like a hammer out of nowhere, and the destruction that followed was not incidental. It was total. Al-Masudi's account in The Meadows of Gold is where the clinical language of medieval historiography briefly cracks open and lets you see something raw. In paraphrase, he presents the Rus as killing, taking captives, seizing property, invading towns and leaving settlements ruined. The Rus did not just raid these towns. They behaved as if nothing and no one in them was off limits. Women and children were taken as slaves, not as a byproduct of the raid, but as a primary objective. Slavery was, as the Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan had already documented, one of the central commercial pillars of the Rus economy. Captives taken on the Caspian would eventually travel north up the Volga and be sold into the markets of the Khazar and Bulgar trading posts, and from there into the wider Islamic world. The brutal irony of that trade route is not lost on anyone who thinks about it too long. The local rulers were not idle. Around this same period, the Alid leader Hassan al-Utrush, a Zaydi Shia missionary and military leader, was fighting to re-establish control in Tabaristan while the Samanids and local powers were also in motion. The region's military attention was divided. When the Rus came out of the Caspian, the coastline was functionally undefended from the sea. There was no fleet ready to oppose them on the water, and whatever armed response came together on land was simply not fast enough or strong enough. Attempts to repel the raiders as they sat at anchor near the islands proved unsuccessful. The sources indicate that local forces tried at least one engagement and were driven back. The Rus held the water, and whoever held the water in 913 AD held the coast. What followed was not a quick raid. This was sustained. Al-Masudi makes clear that the Rus operated on the Caspian coastline for an extended period, weeks, possibly months, working systematically up and down the shoreline, striking one settlement, withdrawing to the island base, reloading, striking another. The region around Abasid, near the mouth of the Gorgon River on the eastern Caspian shore, was hit. The coastline of Gilan, farther west from Abasid, was hit. Tabaristan's coastal towns were hit. The Naphta country, the Azerbaijan region around what's now Baku, where natural oil seeps had created a landscape of eternal flames that drew pilgrims and traders from across the Islamic world, was targeted as well. Al-Masudi records that the Rus killed many Muslims and that no territory on that coast was spared their attention for long. Honestly, this is where the romantic myth of the Vikings, the image that fills 1,000 modern television shows and paperback novels, gets dark in a way that most popular culture refuses to sit with. These men were not misunderstood traders, not philosophical wanderers, not anti-heroes with personal codes of honor. On the Caspian in 913, they operated as a systematic destruction engine against civilian populations who had done nothing to provoke them beyond being wealthy and undefended. The families dragged out of their homes in Gilan, the weavers and merchants and farmers of Tabaristan who woke up one morning to the sound of Rus war cries coming off the water. They were not collateral damage. They were the point. There's another layer to this raid that makes it even more disturbing. The Rus were not just smashing and grabbing, they were learning as they went. Every harbour they struck taught them something about the coastline, which towns had stronger walls, which villages had storehouses near the shore, which stretches of beach allowed them to drag ships in fast and launch again before local riders could gather. That is what makes this expedition feel so modern in its cruelty. It adapted, it refined itself, it became more efficient with every success, and imagine the terror from the other side. A fisherman sees black prowed ships on the horizon where only traders should be. By the time the alarm reaches the marketplace, the first armed men are already jumping into the surf with axes and spears. Mothers are grabbing children. Shopkeepers are trying to hide coin under floorboards. Imams are shouting for order over the noise of people running in every direction at once. Then the Rus hit the streets, and whatever dignity or routine that town had built over generations collapses in a single morning. The worst part is that news moved faster than armies but slower than fear. One town heard rumours of slaughter farther down the coast and had just enough time to panic, not enough time to defend itself. Another thought the stories were exaggerated until smoke appeared over the next bay. Personally, when you read these Persian and Arabic notices side by side, what really gets me is how normal life still was in those towns right before the storm broke. People were weaving cloth, loading animals, arguing over prices, preparing meals. Then history arrived from the sea with an axe in its hand, and the plunder mounted. Ship after ship rode lower in the water as the weeks passed. Gold coins, silver dirhams, silk bolts, fine metalwork, glass, ceramics, food stores, weapons, and captives, hundreds or thousands of them, bound and stacked in the holds. The fleet that had entered the Caspian hungry and ambitious was, by the time it began turning north toward home, loaded past the point of good seamanship. The men on those ships were richer than any Rus raider had any right to be. They had done what no earlier expedition had managed on anything like this scale. They had cracked open the Caspian world and seemed to be sailing away with half its contents. They pointed their prows north toward the Volga Delta and began the long row home. They felt, almost certainly, invincible. All right, before we get to the part where everything goes catastrophically wrong, I want to take 60 seconds to talk about something actually useful for anyone watching this. If you spend time online researching history, and if you're here, you probably do, you know how quickly you can end up geo-blocked from archives, academic databases, or documentary content that's only available in certain countries. I deal with this constantly when I'm researching scripts. The fix I use is NordVPN. One click and you can access content from dozens of different countries, your connection is encrypted, and your browsing stays private. It takes about 2 minutes to set up. There's a link in the description with a special deal for Wars in History viewers. It includes a discount and a money-back guarantee, so there's genuinely no risk. Check it out, support the channel, and let's get back to the Volga, because what happens next is absolutely brutal. Back in Atil, the Khazar capital at the mouth of the Volga, the news from the Caspian had been arriving in fragments all summer. Traders moving north, fishermen, the occasional messenger, they all carried the same story in slightly different versions, each one a little worse than the last. Towns burned, thousands killed, women and children taken, Muslim communities shattered. The Rus had not raided the Caspian coast. They had ravaged it, systematically and without mercy, for months. For the Khagan, this was information to be processed politically. He had made a deal, the Rus had honoured their side by promising him half the plunder, and whatever grief had come to the Muslim cities of the south was, from his perspective, the cost of doing business with men like these. He was a ruler of a multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, and rulers of such empires learn early that maintaining a calculated detachment from any single community's suffering is the price of holding the whole structure together. He was not happy about what had happened to the south, but he was not, in the cold arithmetic of medieval statecraft, going to break a sworn agreement over it. His palace guard had a very different calculation. The Arsia were Muslim soldiers associated with Khwarezm, the ancient region east of the Aral Sea, who had entered Khazar service generations earlier. They were not mercenaries in the casual, opportunistic sense of that word. They were an institutionalized military caste, deeply devout, with families and a community settled in Atil itself. Al-Masudi records that they served the Khazar Khagan on the explicit condition that they would never be required to fight against fellow Muslims. This was the arrangement. This was the line. And what the Rus had spent the summer doing to the cities of Gilan and Tabaristan and Abbaskan was, to the Arsia, not a geopolitical event happening at a comfortable distance. It was an atrocity committed against their co-religionists, their brothers in faith, carried out with the permission of the king they served, and now the perpetrators were rowing north up the Volga, fat with stolen Muslim wealth, intending to sail right past Atil on their way home. The demand the Arsia brought to the Khagan was not a polite request. In practical terms, it was an ultimatum. They had heard what happened in the south. They had heard the numbers, the thousands killed, the women taken, the towns burned to foundations. They were going to meet the Rus on the Volga, and they were going to take their revenge, and the Khagan could either step aside or explain to his own palace guard why the lives of Muslim civilians on the Caspian coast were worth less than the terms of a deal with Rus raiders. The sources record that the Khagan warned the Rus. He sent word ahead that he could not hold the Arsia back. Whether this warning reached anyone and whether it was believed, the text does not say. What the Khagan could not do, or would not do, and with medieval rulers the difference between those two things is often impossible to establish, was physically prevent his own guard from acting. The Arsia were not a small detachment. They were a formidable fighting force, and the anger driving them was not a momentary flare that could be talked down over a day or two of negotiation. It had been building since the first reports from the south arrived, stoking hotter every week as the full scale of the Caspian massacres became clear. When it finally broke, it broke completely. And there was a practical military reality that made the Arsia's position even stronger than pure anger alone. The Khagan could not simply dismiss them or transfer them away from Atil. They were his guard. They protected the capital. Without their loyalty, the entire security architecture of the Khaganate around Atil unraveled. So he found himself in the impossible bind that rulers of multi-ethnic empires have always faced. He had made a promise to an outside party that required him to violate the expectations of the people whose loyalty kept him alive. He could not honour both. He warned the Rus and stepped back. The Arsia went to the river. Whatever private feelings the Khagan held in the days that followed, relief, guilt, calculation, or something colder still, the sources do not record. But you have to wonder what it looked like from inside Atil when the Arsia marched out toward the delta, fully armed, in formation, with the absolute focus of men who have already decided what they're going to do. This was not a mob. This was a professional military force with a mission they believed was not just justified, but required. Every sword in that column had been sharpened in the service of a Jewish Khagan for the defense of a steppe empire. Now those swords were being drawn for a different kind of service entirely. There is something almost inevitable about that moment. The system the Khagan had built had worked too well for too long, and now it was going to settle his accounts for him whether he wanted it to or not. That is the real pressure point of the story. The Arsia were not just angry soldiers, they were part of the security machinery that made Atil governable. Their anger turned the Khagan's bargain from a profitable arrangement into a crisis inside the state itself. If he tried to stop them, he risked undermining the force that protected his capital. If he let them march, he broke the spirit of his bargain with the Rus. Either way, the deal made in spring had become politically poisonous by autumn. So the trap on the Volga was not simply a military ambush. It was also the moment when the Khazar world's internal balance snapped back against the bargain that had compromised it. You can almost feel the tension in that waiting silence along the riverbanks. Horses snorting in the reeds, bowstrings tested in the dark, men staring south knowing the ships were coming, knowing the men aboard them were carrying the stolen wealth of devastated Muslim towns. By then, mercy was no longer part of the discussion. The geography of the Volga Delta made what happened next almost inevitable. The river, before it reaches the Caspian, fans out into a wide, shallow, reed-choked delta, a labyrinth of channels, sandbanks, and narrow passages that forces any large fleet to slow down, compress, and navigate carefully. A fleet of 500 heavily laden ships trying to transit the Volga Delta in the autumn is not a fast-moving force. It is a slow, strung-out, clumsy procession of ships that cannot maneuver quickly, cannot accelerate to escape pursuit, and cannot easily bring its full fighting strength to bear in any single direction at once. It is, in military terms, a convoy in a choke point, and a convoy in a choke point when the enemy has prepared the ground is a killing ground. The Arsia understood this. They had lived around the lower Volga for generations. They knew the local channels, the sandbanks, and the stretches of firm ground where cavalry could move faster than overloaded ships. They could choose places where a large fleet would have to slow down, narrow its formation, and lose the freedom to maneuver. They gathered their forces. Al-Masudi gives the combined Arsia and Christian allies from Atil a total of roughly 15,000 men, and they went to the river and they waited. When the first Rus ships nosed into the delta from the open Caspian, riding low and sluggish with the weight of everything they had taken, they found the banks lined with soldiers. The raiders had come far from the world where their reputation made people run. The Rus came into the delta in the formation they knew, long line ahead, led ships scouting, the rest following close behind. After months on the Caspian, the men were loose, comfortable, already half thinking about the journey home. The golden silk in the holds had a gravitational pull on the imagination. You can picture the conversations happening between oar benches, what they would do with their share, what they would buy, who back home they would impress. Armies that have gotten away with something always carry that looseness in them, that first exhale confidence of men who believe the dangerous part is over. The riverbanks told a different story. The Arsia had chosen their ground with the care of men who had fought on this river before and intended to fight on it again. The Volga Delta offered the defenders exactly what they needed: narrow channels, shallow banks, reeds, sandbars, and places where a large fleet could be forced to slow down and lose formation. It was the kind of waterway local soldiers could understand far better than exhausted outsiders. In that environment, The roughly 15,000 soldiers of the Arsia and their Christian allies from Atil did not need to meet the Rus in open sea. They could wait where the river itself made the fleet vulnerable. When the fighting started, it started badly for the Rus and never got better. Al-Masudi records that the battle lasted 3 days, and those 3 words carry inside them a kind of horror that is easy to miss if you read them too quickly. 3 days is not a clean tactical engagement that goes wrong. 3 days is a grinding, desperate, disintegrating rearguard action by men who are fighting on water against cavalry on land, who cannot maneuver their heavily laden ships in a narrow channel, who cannot outrun horses, and who are slowly, ship by ship, being pushed back toward a sea they cannot re-enter. The Rus were not ambushed and overrun in an hour. They were taken apart methodically, over 3 full days of fighting, with no rescue coming and no route of escape opening up. What made the slaughter so complete was not just violence, it was exhaustion. The Rus had already spent months campaigning far from home. Their arms were heavy. Their discipline was fraying under the false comfort of success. Their ships were burdened with loot and captives. Even before the first arrows fell, they were entering that river at a disadvantage they probably did not fully appreciate. That is one of the cruelest truths in military history. Sometimes an army loses the decisive battle days before the fighting starts, simply by arriving in the wrong condition. You also have to picture what 3 days on that river meant physically. No proper sleep. Wounded men sliding on wet planks, oars abandoned then snatched up again, horses pressing along the bank, arrows rattling into shields all night, damaged ships drifting into one another. By the second day, command must have broken down almost completely. At that point, most men were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting for 1 more hour of life. And then came the final humiliation. Not a glorious last stand sung by skalds, not a clean death in open battle, men trying to flee through reeds, men dragging themselves onto mud banks only to be caught by enemies waiting on shore, men escaping one massacre just to meet another farther north at the hands of the Burtus and the Volga Bulgars. That is why this expedition matters so much. It strips away the heroic varnish. It shows what happens when an army built for terror suddenly discovers that terror can flow both ways. The tactics the Arsia used did not need to be elaborate. Archers on the banks could strike exposed crews on open decks. Ships that lost enough men to become unmanageable could drift into shallows or collide with other vessels. Ships trying to push through narrow channels could be met by fresh forces farther upriver, while ships trying to turn back risked jamming into the fleet behind them. The convoy, strung out over the river, could not easily compress into a defensive formation. Many ships must have fought almost alone. Some of the Rus beached their ships and tried to fight their way out on foot, moving across the steppe banks toward what they apparently hoped were friendly Bulgar or Burtus territories to the north. This was the desperation of men with no maritime option left, and it solved nothing. Al-Masudi records that those who escaped the Volga battle and pushed north up the river were caught and killed by the Burtus people, and then by the Volga Bulgars further upriver. The land route was closed, the water was controlled, the steppe offered no cover and no allies. The noose that the Arsia had drawn tight at the river mouth caught almost everything. Al-Masudi puts the dead at around 30,000 men in the battle itself, a number that, even accounting for the tendency of medieval sources to round upward dramatically, speaks to annihilation rather than ordinary defeat. A smaller group of survivors, perhaps several thousand in some accounts, managed to get past the Arsia and flee north, but most of them were killed later by the Burtus and the Volga Bulgars before the winter closed in. What came back to Novgorod and Kiev from the greatest Rus raid in Eastern history was not a triumphant fleet. It was a ghost story carried by broken men, if it came back at all. Most of the plunder never made it north. Some sank with the ships. Some was abandoned when Rus warriors beached their vessels and fled on foot into the steppe. Some was taken by the Arsia, the Bulgars, and the Burtus as the spoils of victory. The fate of many captives disappears from the record entirely. What a few survivors carried home to Kiev and Novgorod, if any survivors made it that far, was only a shadow of what had been taken. The Khagan got little or nothing from the bargain he had made so confidently in the spring of 913 AD. His palace guard had acted against the spirit of his deal, his river had become a battlefield, and the political stability of his multi-religious capital had been badly shaken. The Great Caspian Expedition returned to the Rus world not as a legend of victory, but as a warning carved into collective memory. Personally, this is the moment in the story that I keep coming back to. Not the battle itself, but the silence after it. 3 days of fighting on a river, and then nothing. The water clears, the wreckage drifts south into the Caspian, the Arsia ride back to Atil. The surviving Rus scatter into the steppe and disappear from the story. And somewhere in a chronicle room decades later, al-Masudi writes it all down in his careful Arabic prose, and one of the main reasons we know any of it happened is because one Arab geographer decided this story was worth preserving. There is something deeply unsettling about how close this entire event came to vanishing entirely from the historical record. The Rus did not return to the Caspian for roughly 30 years. That silence says enough. Men in the north remembered what happened on the Volga. They remembered that there was a sea beyond the steppe, where fortunes could be made, but also a river mouth where whole fleets could vanish. The Khazar Khaganate survived the immediate crisis, but the bargain of 913 AD exposed a weakness inside the empire that no treasury could fully repair. A ruler had opened the gate for profit, and his own Muslim guard had answered that decision with blood. That kind of fracture does not disappear. It lingers. For the Rus, this was more than a defeat. It was the destruction of a myth. They had crossed half a continent, broken wealthy coastlines, and believed that success at sea guaranteed safety on the road home. Instead, the very scale of their brutality created the force that destroyed them. Personally, I think that is why this story hit so hard. It is not just about Vikings losing. It is about greed becoming a trap, and about violence building its own avenger. The river kept the gold, the steppe kept the bones, and the empire they thought they could use as a doorway became the graveyard of their ambition. If you made it to the end of this one, genuinely thank you. This is one of the most fascinating and brutal stories I've found in all the years I've been researching Eastern European military history, and the fact that it is still so little known outside of specialist circles genuinely drives me a little crazy. Stories like this deserve to be heard. If you want to make sure you never miss a script like this one, hit subscribe right now. It costs you nothing, and it keeps this channel alive. If you want to go further and actually help Wars in History grow, YouTube memberships are open. Members get early access to scripts, behind-the-scenes research notes, and the ability to vote on future video topics. The link is right below this video, and if you are hungry for more right now, the next video is already waiting for you. Stay on the channel. The history does not stop here.